plenary session to really focus on three things. So I'm trying to understand where we are in the competitive landscape. One of the things we have to understand is a lot of things are changing, from the sense of both technology, regulation, as well as globalization. These trends come in and come out. So what we try to understand is how the current competitive landscape is being shaped. What is actually happening? What are the big global mega trends that are going to be defining not just the current environment, but the next 5 or even 10 years? For that, we got Dr. Anil Gupta to call up. I will introduce him later on, but he's a bit like a global guru, and he will almost shape the conversation. After Dr. Gupta has done for about a 25-minute speech identifying these big trends, we shall go to the next session, which is really a conversation between Dr. Gupta as well as the Minister of Miti to talk really about how Malaysia is actually getting ready. What are the regulatory changes that need to happen? I think one of the aspects that you will hear throughout this session is speed. The world is changing at a dramatic pace, and that dramatic pace means not only do companies have to adjust to the environment, but regulators have to change as well. And after we have done that, we shall have a session of how companies actually need to respond. And for that, we have Professor Charlie Fine and Professor Loredana Padurian. And they are our management MIT gurus. And they will try to phrase that discussion from a practical day-to-day perspective. And after they are done, I will provide a very short wrap-up. So without further ado, perhaps let me introduce Dr. Gupta. One of the things about this sort of job is that when you have to introduce people, the bios are unbelievably long and unbelievably impressive. So I'm only going to say a couple of things about Dr. Gupta. So he's been at the forefront of thinking about global trends, is one of the leading experts on strategy, globalization, and entrepreneurship. And I think the one that I quite liked was that he was named by The Economist as one of the superstars on a cover story on innovation in emerging economies. And given how cynical The Economist is, that's very high praise. So rather than me going on and on about Dr. Gupta, let me stop here and introduce Dr. Gupta to talk about mega trends and how the current environment is being shaped. Please welcome Dr. Gupta. Thanks a lot. Let me hand you the baton.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Karim Bhoy, honorable ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Of course, the subject matter of what I will talk about, Mr. Karim Bhoy has already introduced. Think back over the last 25 years. So in 1990, how many of us in this room had a mobile phone? Think of 2005. What did social media mean? In 2005, what it meant was walking over to your neighbor to borrow the newspapers. The world has changed profoundly. Now, if you think about change as really exponential, even if the pace of change remains the same in an exponential way, it's reasonable to anticipate that over the next 10 years, the world around us, along many dimensions, will change as much as it has changed over the last 25. So here is a take on what I see are some of the major megatrends. And here what I will do is focus on some of them in some depth, but just give you a precursor. Number one is that Asia essentially is becoming the world's economic center, not yet the technological center. I think Silicon Valley is far ahead of Beijing or Bangalore or Singapore. But economically, I think reasonable to predict that by 2025, Asia's GDP could be as large or even larger than US and Europe combined. 3, 4, and 5 are what I will go a little bit deeper into. Number 6 is really about, the world the world population is growing at a slower pace. Median age is rising, and it's rising pretty much all over the world. And so that has huge implications for, of course, old age dependency, for the government budgets, government debts, deficits, and the like. Growing food insecurity, not because the population is growing, but really because population is changing its eating habits from vegetarian to non-vegetarian food. If you get much of your calories from chicken, that's 2.5 times of grain. If you get it through beef, for example, it's 5 times. So that, and of course, rising geopolitical risks that those of us who live or visit this region are very well aware of. That over the last 10 years, cross-border flows of data have grown 45 times. Now, of course, you can say, well, everybody is connected, mobile broadband and the internet and the like, etc. So economically, what does it mean? And this is a fascinating piece of conclusion from a recent report by McKinsey Global Institute that actually in 2014, the economic impact in terms of GDP globally of cross-border movement of data was larger than that of cross-border movement in goods. So that's how important this has become. And naturally, for all the obvious reasons, we can anticipate that that story will only become more powerful in the coming years. In addition to that, of course, if you look at some of the new developments, like TPP, like the One Belt, One Road, and so on. So, and again, TPP, I think, is a great thing. One Belt, One Road is a great thing. But these are, that if you look at the details, is that TPP is more than, of course, it is about helping to counter, if you will, the stalling in terms of growth in trade in goods. But it's more than about just trade. It's about actually all the things connected to the movement of technology, of know-how, in terms of the intellectual property provisions, movement of capital in terms of investor protection, investor-state relationships, and so on. And of course, if you look at the One Belt, One Road, once again, One Belt, One Road is as much about trade, but it's also about investment, about movement of capital. I think it's a great thing. It's a great thing for all countries, not just China, of course, or ASEAN region, but India and others. But I think the One Belt, One Road will take some time to show its results there. Climate change, another one, and there was a time when countries like China and India, some of the biggest, let's say, emitters of greenhouse gases, took the position that climate change is their problem, their being the rich countries' problem, because they put it out there. Yeah, yes, of course, it is true that the last 200 years of industrial revolution, really driven by the rich countries, has caused much of the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere, in the ozone layer. But today, the time has come when actually you look at what are some of the dirtiest cities in the world, what is the impact of global warming on the weather patterns in China or India or other parts of the world, is that it's no longer their problem. It is actually embraced by the leaders in emerging markets as our problem, as in fact the Honorable Prime Minister talked about sustainability. It's no longer their problem, and so on, etc. So large corporations, and today, of course, many of the big corporations of the world are massively powerful, as, of course, economic entities, as technological entities. And just the latest example of the power of institutions is you take a company like Apple Computer, okay, with the biggest market cap in the world, that Apple took head-on the US government, the FBI. And so that's what we mean, and basically said, we are not going to do what you want us to do because you are wrong and we are right. And at the end of the day, at least it seems right now, that Apple won. But what's happening now is that while these institutions remain powerful, individuals are actually becoming extremely powerful in their own rights, at times even more powerful than governments or corporations. Ecosystems and mashups, which is really, instead of thinking of value creation and value capture largely within the boundaries of the company, to really think of the company as just one component within a broader ecosystem. You look at what's happening at Goldman Sachs. Is Goldman Sachs an investment bank, or is it really a technology company? That out of 33,000 people at Goldman, 10,000 are actually engineers and programmers. So that's what we mean by embracing the future with gusto. Zero distance. We talk about, of course, in this era, you have hyper competition, And that hyper-competition means that many companies will die, but some will survive. And what will be the features of the companies that survive? And I find Amazon, Jeff Bezos, a phenomenal example of really zero distance between the company and the customer. Bezos has been absolutely maniacal in terms of saying he wants to create the most customer-centric company, not just in online retailing, e-commerce, but across all industry sectors. And it's amazing how far they have moved. I'm one of the millions of avid Amazon customers, and it's kind of mind-blowing the customer centricity that they're able to bring. So it's really thinking about sustainability end to end and not just within the company's boundaries. Of course, impact investing is already here. Companies like Goldman and BlackRock and so on, they are embracing and moving into creating, in fact, financial products that explicitly take into account sustainability, ethics, and governance. So obviously, a company like Google has to make these long-term bets, long-term investments. But how on earth do you make these long-term bets in a highly dynamic world? And really what a company like Google does is that at any point in time, they do have a long-term vision of where the world is moving, where the new opportunities for value creation, value capture exist. But what they do is that instead of locking themselves into a 5-year planning cycle, if you will, that you have a long-term strategy, but you are constantly revisiting it, almost like on a week-by-week, month-by-month, quarter-by-quarter basis, so that you always have a long-term vision, but that long-term vision is being revised pretty much on an ongoing basis because you have your ears to the ground. So, to sum up, essentially, what we have is, it's a tiger, okay, and it's a powerful tiger that's, running around and kind of basically moving at a hectic pace. And we as individuals, as corporate executives, as political leaders, really have only two choices. Either we can figure out how to ride the tiger, or if we can't, we are going to be trampled by the tiger. So it's moving very much towards that binary kind of choice. So with that, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll let you stay on the panel. And now I'd like to invite Dato Sri Mustafa Mohammed, who's the Minister of International Trade and Industry, and particularly interesting fellow because he was in cabinet 20 years ago as Minister of Entrepreneurship. So I'd like you to take a seat as well. And I think we'll kick off the Q&A session with a very simple question. Dato Sri, having heard that speech about the speed, about how we need to adapt, how technology is driving so much within people's processes, how do you see Malaysia approaching this challenge? Are we ready? How can we do better? And how can we succeed as companies in this world?
Thank you, Sadiq, and thank you, Dr. Gupta. Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's been a long morning for everyone. Firstly, I'm excited, yeah, but the challenge is, after hearing from you, Dr. Gupta, some of the mega trends around us, but as I listen to you, I worry about some people in Malaysia, yeah, those in the villages, the remotest parts of the country. How do you bring this to them? How do you get them to understand that the world is changing? Yeah? How do you make sure that they come on board? That's the biggest worry. So this is an issue of how to make this inclusive, understanding the challenges. At the same time, of course, we're excited because there are opportunities. Yeah? So that's point number one. Point number two, getting those of us in government to understand what's going on is a challenge. There's so many changes going on, and policies have got to move in tandem with these rapid changes. That's a big challenge. And there's a lag in terms of policies in some parts of the world. Yeah? We have done economic transformation in Malaysia, government transformation. Having said that, the world is changing very fast. So that's number two, yeah? Which is how to get government to be on the mark and move fast to adapt to this new reality. Three, our corporate people. There are opportunities. You talk about China, the rise of Asia, yeah? And the small and medium enterprises, here again, issue of inclusiveness, inclusivity, yeah? Whether they are aware of what's going on around the world. So those are some of the challenges we have. I'm excited, some of us are excited, but the challenge is, can we get everyone on board? Those in the remote part of India or Malaysia or in Sabah, Sarawak, where I come from, Kelantan, and get them to understand that the world is changing, yeah? And secondly, how to get policy makers to move fast, and for the corporate leaders, how do we seize these opportunities? Are we responding fast enough to this new reality? Are we seizing these opportunities? I mean, we want to succeed as a nation. We want to do well. We want to do better. We have a plan. Prime Minister said we have economic policies. We have plans. We have good track record. But can we be assured that the future is safe and secure with all these rapid changes going around? So those are some challenges, some opportunities that I see we need to deal with in the next few months.
I'm going to actually take that a little bit further, in part because in previous conference calls with Dr. Anil Gupta particularly, what strikes me is that the world, particularly developed world, is getting much more complicated. Even as Asia is becoming more inclusive about regional growth, TPP, AEC, RCEP, which we saw a little bit earlier on as well. Brexit has the mayor of London wanting to leave Europe. And Mr. Donald Trump is very, very active about trashing things, and Bernie has moved Hillary further to the left. Income inequality is a natural part of technological progress. So my question is, how is that being addressed in the developed world, and what is your outlook? And then I'll switch to the minister as well to say how that will impact this part of the world and Malaysia in particular.
Yeah. I mean, you know, if I look at income inequality, and you know, probably it's useful to look at it at two levels. So if you look globally, with the rise of emerging economies, income inequality is actually coming down, because as Asia, for instance, becomes richer, the income gap between Asia and Europe or Asia and the United States comes down. However, a second and at least equally important lens on income inequality is to look at particularly what's happening in the rich countries. So if you look at, for instance, the United States, where I live, is that because of course, technology and automation in both blue-collar and white-collar work, and because of globalization, and of course, the globalization has a direct impact on both blue and white-collar work, is that economists have estimated that since 1990 until now, that's 25 years, controlling for inflation, adjusted for inflation, 90% of Americans, their wages have not increased. Now, obviously, the economy has continued to grow in real terms at 2.5% to 3% a year, which means almost the entire gains of economic growth have been captured by people at the top 10% or the 5% or the 1%, because returns to knowledge and returns to capital, the gap between those versus the returns to labor has expanded. And now, given that situation, of course, no less than Mayor Bloomberg of New York City, about 3 years back, he said, and this is before Occupy Wall Street movement, before Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders phenomena, and so on, he said, if this trend continues, I can predict that there will be riots in New York City. And of course, we have seen that happen, of course, New York City, San Francisco, and so on. And the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of Bernie Sanders, it's because the people who are not benefiting from economic growth, they're angry, they're frustrated. And when the society, bulk of the people are angry and frustrated, let's say even more angry, frustrated, the bottom 30% of society, they move towards the polar extremes, be that on the left or be that on the right. Now, one hopes, of course, that at the end of the day, the American voters will be sensible, and somebody, perhaps like Hillary Clinton will be, so you can see, of course, where my biases are, will be the next president. But this is a major phenomenon, and, it's nowhere close to being addressed, because the thing is, how on earth do you slow down globalization? How on earth do you slow down the march of technology? And if that continues, I think inequality is an enduring problem. Now, some solutions, but they're only partial solutions, like what happened very recently in San Francisco and New York City, is to increase minimum wages from around $10, $11 an hour to $15 an hour. That's good, but that's only a small part of a wider discussion. And still, I mean, people haven't figured out how to solve it, but it's a major problem.
I think from the Minister, your perspective, trade has been a phenomenal driver of growth in the region, which I think is phenomenal and will continue to grow. I mean, the AEC is a much bigger marketplace. As you see technology beginning to impact throughout, some companies will not be able to adapt fast enough, and they could fail. When you think about that, at the same time, you think about the inclusiveness of growth. How do you balance those two things?
In this part of the world, ASEAN, for us, ASEAN is a priority. We've been talking about ASEAN, closer ASEAN economic integration, and trade and investments have been one of the main drivers of growth for decades, and tourism. These are investments, trade, and tourism. So the challenge is how do you, following on Dr. Gupta's point about wage levels, I mean, in some countries, for example, in Japan, the percentage of temporary workers, which is a growing phenomenon in many parts of the Western world. In Japan, they say probably a third of people are in that category. So this is a trend. So here in ASEAN, we have the challenge is how to move up the value chain. We have been good at production, assembly type operations. And for us, for Malaysia to be a high income economy, we need to embrace innovation, technology, and the role played by multinational companies and local companies as well. So, I mean, it's not only about growth, it is also about incomes, quality jobs, and that is why ASEAN comes in. We want to be part of the global value chain. We want, you mentioned GE as an example. GE is big in Malaysia, Honeywell, these are some examples. So for us, I mean, for Malaysia in particular, we've been good at the assembly type operations 40 years ago. That was how we started. But going forward, it is the design, development, getting the higher end activities to be located here in Malaysia, getting companies to locate the headquarters in Malaysia, service, knowledge-intensive jobs. So this is the future for Malaysia, which is making sure that investments we receive from overseas and also Malaysian investments are in the sectors and industries that enable us to prosper. And that's what we're doing in Malaysia. But the challenge for us in ASEAN at the bigger level, I mean, how can trade and investments help improve incomes? Yeah? That's a big challenge. ASEAN, as we know, is that we have 3 groups of countries. The more developed, Singapore is a developed nation, Malaysia in the middle, Indonesia, Thailand, and at the bottom we have Myanmar. So we want to, ASEAN is a community now. A community means we are one. We have one vision, one objective. We want to prosper. We want to spread the benefits of development. So these are the challenges. So the challenge is, in summary, how do you make sure that this tourism flows into ASEAN, investment flows coming to ASEAN, trade numbers which continue to boom, not only coming from outside, but within the region, intra-ASEAN investments, intra-ASEAN trade, intra-ASEAN tourist flows. How to make sure that this brings about benefits to the biggest number of people in ASEAN. That's a challenge. And in our vision for the future, 2025, 2016 to 2025, inclusiveness is one big agenda.
Actually, on that note, I think it's a very important point. It was referenced a little bit in Anil's presentation. We talked about the 4th industrial revolution, the rise of robots and things like that will change manufacturing processes. How do Malaysian companies succeed in this environment? You talked a bit about more R&D. How can we ensure that this has happened? And I think you mentioned earlier on, there's no complacency in terms of the achievements that have already happened. What is the message that you'd like to give in what we're doing, what you're doing, and what needs to be done?
That's a big challenge. The Prime Minister alluded to this in his speech. The role of education and training and retraining, that's crucial. I mean, we've been talking about this. I mean, the issue is how to implement an effective program and plan to make sure that these things happen. I mean, we know what the problems are, yeah? The fourth industrial revolution is here to stay, is with us, yeah? The convergence of physical and digital, all these things, it is happening very fast. We have to be part of this. We have to be agile. We got to adopt to this new reality. Our young people need to be able to embrace, you know, smartphones and all these things. So the biggest challenge is human capital development, yeah? How do we change the curriculum? How do we produce, Prime Minister made reference to higher order thinking skills, yeah? I mean, it's not the 1+1 kind of stuff. It's creativity, innovation. That's a big challenge, yeah? Challenge is a global challenge, but we want to be a developed nation, and for us, this is something that, as I say, we know what the problems are, what the challenges are. I think that what we need to do is to make sure that the implementation mechanism is there for us to make sure that we are able to address these challenges effectively. And we've got to do fast. I mean, we cannot be waiting. I mean, the world is not, we cannot say, please wait for us. We're not ready yet, no. Yeah? This fourth industrial revolution is happening, yeah, very rapidly, and the biggest challenge would be education, training. Unless we do that successfully, we're not going to be successful in transforming the Malaysian economy.
And I actually want to ask Dr. Gupta a question, in part because, I mean, I was born in Pakistan, and how much it pains me. India has done remarkably well and will continue to do remarkably well. And you were talking a little bit about innovation in India yesterday compared to China, that I thought was very interesting. Sometimes we look only at China, but actually the Indian story is gaining momentum and getting even stronger, even as the ASEAN story is developing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you know, so if I look at innovation, and I've, you know, looked at what's happening in India, and as you said, you know, India compared to China, and of course, you know, I have both a professional and a personal interest in doing that because, you know, I'm a son of India, even though I'm a US citizen right now. But actually, I'm a son-in-law of China. My wife, my co-author, is Chinese from PRC. So that gives me a particularly stronger incentive to become deeper in my understanding of China. And when I do that, it's kind of interesting. Of course, China as an economy is much larger than India. It's 5 times as large as India. If you look at in total, at the country level, private public sector combined, investment in R&D per year in China, percentage of GDP is twice that of India, about 2% of GDP versus 1% for India, which means China as a country spends 10 times of India on R&D. But interestingly, if you look at, for instance, data from the US Patent Trademark Office, from Japan Patent Office, from the European Patent Office, that the kind of gold standard patents coming out of India, of course, Indian companies, but also companies like GE India, or Honeywell India, or Caterpillar India, or Google India, that patents coming out, that the gap between India and China is only 1 to 2. So which means that at least at a crude level, the productivity of R&D in India is 5 times that of China. And so, you know, and of course, you know, the cultural aspects have something to do with it because it's easy in India to wake up in the morning and look at the newspaper, and the newspaper headline might be "The Prime Minister is an idiot." And so, you know, of course, which means that how much you can question authority. So that makes a difference. But also, if we look at entrepreneurship, not just innovation, is that, of course, entrepreneurship is alive and well and roaring in China, especially places like Beijing and Shenzhen and Shanghai, Nanjing. But it's also alive and well and thriving in Bangalore, but with a difference. And the difference is, once again, that if you look at venture capital investment, is Chinese economy 5 times that of India, but in terms of VC investment in China, roaring, but VC investment in India is also roaring, but the gap is again 1 to 2. So by that measure. But also there's another difference, is that in China, particularly in the technology sector, the government has chosen to put more or less like a wall around the garden, so that companies like Baidu and others, they have, let's say, protection, if you will, a policy protection from global competitors. India, there is no such thing. So Amazon and Google and Twitter and Facebook and Microsoft and others can compete as fiercely, as vigorously. And what that means is that Indian tech companies, to survive, they have to work much harder. They have to move much faster. And not just in terms of localization front, but also the technology front in order to be able to compete against the Amazons and the Googles of this world. And so what that means is that Indian entrepreneurial tech ventures are globalizing at a faster pace. Because it's almost like, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. But the same way, in that sense, if you can make it in Bangalore, you can make it anywhere. So those are some of the differences. India well behind China, but in the entrepreneurship and innovation domain, it has some major strengths.
So from a Malaysian perspective, as we think about entrepreneurship and innovation, how do you define sustainability?
How do you
Define sustainability. What does sustainability mean to you in that context? Because it is a very dynamic context.
Firstly, the Indian in Dr. Gupta, the Chinese I see in him, and the American I see in him. This is, very, of course, a rewarding experience to be able to share this platform with you. I mean, it's about talent. Yeah, talent. You need to get the best talent to be successful. The Indians, you talk about the Indians, the Chinese, and of course the Americans as well. That's the future. So to be sustainable, I'm looking from the point of view of sustainability. It's important for us to have this fusion of all the best brains throughout the world. I mean, we have to open up our doors and windows, to foreigners. I mean, that's our policy. In manufacturing, we have 100% foreign ownership. We've been opening the service sector more and more. In TPP, we are actively involved in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So the world is getting smaller. So to be sustainable, one is you have to embrace this global agenda. Of course, you have people who don't like globalization for obvious reasons, because they don't see the benefits of globalization. So from the global point of view, I mean, from Malaysia as well, to have a sustainable economic agenda, it's important for us to innovate. It is important for us to promote the green agenda, of course, carbon emission, but more and more, I think talent is so essential. To be able to maintain this pace of growth, I mean, we've been growing at 7%, 8%, or in those best years, 10%. It's important for us to embrace talent, to make sure that we are as open as possible. Otherwise, we cannot have sustainable growth. And we cannot be too dependent on China or India. You have Make in India, for example, and Made in China 2025. There's so many things going on. And to have a sustainable economic agenda, we have to be open. We have to be open-minded. We have to be open to new ideas. We have to innovate. And once again, education is key. We need young people who are agile, who are flexible, who can adapt to this very rapidly changing world environment. So we need some Chinese in us, some Indian, some American. And we are in this fortunate position in Malaysia. We are in between. I mean, strategically, geopolitically, we are in the middle of ASEAN. We have Chinese influence, Indian influence, some American influence. And Malaysia has been, in a positive way, a melting pot of talent. There's been a lot of people coming here. And in my view, we need to be as open as possible, respecting, of course, culture and religion. If you don't do that, you cannot survive in this competitive environment. So that's my take on sustainability. Yeah.
I think that's great. I think perhaps one last question for Dr. Gupta. When you think about Malaysia, how do you think Malaysian companies can thrive in this environment from your perspective, and having heard the minister and met people as well the last day or two?
Yeah. So actually, I mean, when I think of Malaysian companies, and, in light of the global mega trends that I was talking about, essentially, so I would say, pick 2 or 3 things. Number one is that if you look at all the technological disruption, which is probably even more important in terms of its impact on economies than, say, the ASEAN Economic Community or TPP, is number one is really in terms of riding the technological disruption game on the bell curve. Where are you as a company? It's like Goldman Sachs, of course. If 10,000 out of 33,000, what they're aiming to do is to be not just an investment, not just a bank, but a technology company, right? And so number one is that on the bell curve, to be on the right tail rather than in the middle or the left tail. So that's number one. Number two is that in a technology-driven world, one will typically see more consolidation and scale has an advantage. And so there, along with technological disruption, is to leverage the ASEAN Economic Community, leverage TPP and these developments to scale up at a faster pace than you otherwise might. And a third thing, I would add is that as this, in order to do this, is that today you can access talent and technologies pretty much anywhere in the world. So you could be a company that is hypothetically Malaysian because its ownership or headquarters are in Malaysia. But there is not a whole lot that prevents the company from accessing technology being created and the talent that may reside in Israel, that may reside in Bangalore,
Sure.
that may reside in Shenzhen. And so essentially, how can you leverage, or Silicon Valley, global technologies and global talent to be on the right tail of technological disruption and scale up? So that would be one way to put it.
Would you like to add anything to that, Minister, before we close? Would you like to add anything?
Yes, I think scale is indeed very important. We're only 30 million people. We're a small market. We have to go out, and Malaysian companies will go out. Malaysian professionals are everywhere in the world. We have more than 1 million Malaysian working overseas, not as many as Indians or the Filipinos, but more and more. We need to have a global orientation. So scale, whether you're talking about a company or a country, so that's the reality. And the challenge for us is to get our people to understand how important it is to be part of this global agenda. The world is getting smaller, smartphones and the fourth industrial revolution. These developments have brought us closer to each other. We need to talk to each other more often. Yeah? We need to network. Yeah? We need to export more and investments overseas and tourism. So scale is important, and that's why Malaysia has always been an open economy. We have embraced change, but I wish, we should be, if you ask what my wish list is, I wish we move faster on this road of more openness, more globalization, and be an even more integral part of the global supply chain. We are not there yet. We have made a lot of progress, but I think the way forward for us is to embrace the global agenda. Yes, globalization has got many challenges, downside, but overall, putting everything together, Malaysia has been one of the major beneficiaries of globalization, whether you're talking about investments or trade or tourism. So let's stay the course, don't backtrack, and make sure that we adapt to this new reality and make sure that our policies are consistent and our education responds very quickly to this changing development.
Actually, that's actually a wonderful way to go to the next section, because the next section will have Dr. Fine and Loredana talk about, in many ways, how the supply chain is also changing in the current environment. And also, as you know, it's formed by the MIT, they're part of the Asian School of Business, bringing talent here to actually train talent here. And of course, that is also sponsored by Bank Negara. So I think, thank you very much. I think we should let you go back to the audience and introduce Dr. Fine and Dr. Paduan.
Thank you, Sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.